Welcome back to Guide to the Global Economy. I'm Josh Lipsky, Director of the Atlantic Council's GeoEconomics Center. On today's episode, we're going to look at what's happening in Pakistan ahead of their election and AI funding, which countries are taking the lead. But first, I want to turn to Mrugank Bhusari, Assistant Director at the GeoEconomics Center, to look at our lead this week, where we focused on Brazil. Gank, what about Brazil interested us?
Josh, Brazil is hosting the presidency of the G20 for the first time, and it's made food security one of its main priorities for the year. And so we wanted to see what kind of influence Brazil has as an agricultural exporter to all of the G20 economies and the rest of the world.
Well, let's take a look at the data. So here's the lead chart. Walk us through it.
So Josh, in this graph, you can see the percentage of agriculture imports for all of these G20 economies and a few others that come from Brazil. And what you see very clearly is that a lot of these emerging markets and what the group that has been sometimes called the Global South gets really a high percentage of its imports, agricultural imports, from Brazil.
I mean, China, jumps off the chart here. You see what a significant percentage they get from Brazil. Exactly. That's changed over the past 10, 15 years. This would have looked different if we went back to the 90s.
It would have. And in fact, the US has always been a major exporter of agricultural goods. In fact, it still is. It still is the largest agricultural exporter to the world.
If you looked at these numbers on the US side, for a lot of them, the US would be in the lead. But Brazil is number 2 for many and 1 for some.
And that has changed in the last 10, 15 years. Partly, Brazil has become an agricultural powerhouse as well. The amount of land that has been under cultivation has increased. But also there's been external factors. For instance, we mentioned China. Yeah. China and the US in the last 10 years, as trade tensions and trade frictions have gotten a bit more tense, Beijing has made a very active decision to diversify agricultural imports away from the US. And Brazil has been the largest beneficiary of that.
I mean, one thing that's well known about China is what a priority they place on food security. This is Brazil's G20 presidency priority as well. But the ability to feed the Chinese people, because it is not an agricultural producer in a major way for enough of its citizens. So it makes sense from that perspective to try to diversify, and you see them going to Brazil. But it's not just China. There's a range of countries in the global south, as you pointed out.
It is, and one thing I will point out about China is that it's not just a bystander. It is very actively invested in a lot of trade-oriented infrastructures in the last 10 years as well. So the COFCO, which is, I believe, it has invested it is a state-owned company which has invested around $2 billion in Brazilian infrastructures, which includes, most importantly, the Port of Santos, which is one of the largest ports in Latin America, and also about 30% of Brazil's trade finance flows through the Port of Santos.
So China's helping these developments, clearly. I mean, Mexico's interesting, right? Because here you have a U.S. neighbor which is not really following the pattern.
That's mostly because of NAFTA. Yeah, so that's mostly because a lot of American grain and American exports go to Mexico.
And I would imagine, post Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia obviously being an exporter of wheat as well, this has put food security higher on everyone's agenda than it was a few years ago.
Exactly. I think one thing a lot of the world has realized is that agricultural exports can sometimes your supply chains can become unpredictable, as has become in the case since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and then a lot of countries were unable to get their regular imports of wheat especially.
And what does this mean for Brazil's foreign policy, for Brazil's ability to, have its priorities set? Because it now plays a critical role in other countries being able to support their citizens.
One thing that is very much that we should note is that Brazil is also trying to position itself as a representative of the Global South. So India did this last year with its own presidency of the G20, where India has its strength in digital infrastructures and reform of multilateral institutions. That's something that it knows that it has something to provide all countries around the world that very few other countries can. And Brazil is doing something similar, where it knows that it has influence with its agricultural exports, it has the know-how, it has countries that trust it and that think that Brazil can actually be a voice. And so that is what Brazil is doing here as well, because it is really making hunger reduction a main priority.
It's interesting you said India, because India's sort of unofficial motto last year was they wanted to be the voice of the Global South. And one way to look at this chart is Brazil is feeding the Global South, and that puts it in a very strong position heading into this year's G20. We'll continue to look at it throughout the year and follow all the G20 developments. Gank, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Josh.
by the numbers this week, I want to bring in Ryan Murphy, Program Assistant at the Economic Statecraft Initiative in the GeoEconomics Center. Ryan, what was our big number this week?
Our bigger number this week, Josh, was $10 billion, and that's how much OpenAI has raised between last year and this year in private funding.
Okay, and within the $10 billion, of course, we wanted to look at some country-by-country comparisons.
Exactly. So actually, we think about OpenAI. This is the makers of ChatGPT. This is only one part of the larger story. So when we scale out to just look at the U.S. in comparison, we see that the U.S. has raised $14 billion. Now, it sounds like a lot just as a number, but when we compare this to the next largest funders, so we think about EU companies, companies in the UK, they haven't even broken $1 billion yet.
And let's see what that looks like when we visualized it. So here it is. Walk us through it.
Exactly. So we see here, these are the largest AI companies that have developed private capital this past year. And so we have the top 5 are all uniquely located in the US, together comprising over $14 billion. And then in the EU, we have led by Hugging Face, excellent name.
Some follow-up questions on that name, but we'll come back to it.
Which have not even cracked $1 billion yet. And similar with the UK, this is $200 million.
You know, and there's tradition here. The U.S. has led in tech innovation. We think of internet companies, we think of Google. So this is kind of following a pattern that's played out over the last 20 or 30 years. But while the U.S. innovates, sometimes the saying goes that Europe regulates. Is that true in the AI space?
Exactly. So in December, we have some preliminary agreement on this EU AI Act. And this is a set of new regulations for large language models and other models. And when we talk about large language models, we're talking about stuff like ChatGPT. That would create new reporting requirements for many of these companies.
I mean, Ryan, is it a chicken or the egg thing here? Is the U.S. bigger because it has fewer regulations, or is it something else driving innovation here?
I think regulations tell only part of the story. And so, yes, regulations could create some kind of burden for companies, especially new companies, but especially the absence of capital. So we talk about like a lack of venture capital, especially in European markets, as well as actually, interestingly, a lot of this first wave of innovation. So think about Amazon, think about Airbnb. Those startups, which were once startups and now they're larger companies, have actually created greater demand for AI as well. And so we have follow-on effects from this first revolution, this first wave of tech entrepreneurship that's still playing out here in the AI space.
That's such a good point, because if you think of OpenAI's board and Microsoft's involvement in OpenAI's board, they would never have the funds to do that if it wasn't for the decades of innovation from Microsoft and other tech companies. So it can become a bit self-fulfilling in that way.
Precisely. And van der Leyen actually said that in her speech when she introduced these new regulations. The EU is doing what Microsoft did for ChatGPT and opening up these new supercomputers to train these new models.
So the EU wants to catch up, but it's a long road to go.
Exactly.
So we have new reporting requirements for some of these companies in Europe, but the biggest companies in the US, how are the European companies handling that?
Not very well, or at least they've had some opposition. And so even in December, we have French President Emmanuel Macron saying that this would hinder some innovation. He also says that we have to actually create these companies before we start regulating them. Very interesting quote.
And at least one of these is French, right?
Yes, Mistral AI, which is actually founded in Paris.
Interesting.
Only about a year old. But otherwise, we see, again, some of this pushback and then adaptation on the European front. So along with these new rules, we have additional support provided just the last week to funding AI. So we have increased access to EU supercomputers. We have joint ventures and equity support from the Commission.
And in the U.S. side, of course, we had the major executive order from the Biden administration, probably more to come on the regulatory front. But can the U.S. and EU do anything together in this space?
Absolutely. So we look forward next to the Trade and Technology Council, the TTC.
And we just had Secretary Raimondo and Executive Vice President Vestager here at the council talking about that.
Exactly. And so they had last met previously in May of 2023 to talk specifically about AI, and they'd come up with a kind of code of conduct, voluntary again. But it shows in part how much there still is to reach some kind of common ground between these two.
Yeah, and you can see if the U.S. dominates here, but if the U.S. and the EU could agree together on a common framework, that would dwarf anything else that would come, even, and we should point out, we don't have Chinese data here. So that's a big missing piece that we'll continue to follow here at the Council. One of the most important issues around the world, AI. Ryan, thanks for looking into it for us.
Thank you so much, Josh.
For Under the Radar this week, we wanted to look at Pakistan. They have an upcoming election, and I want to bring in Leila Hamilton, young global professional with us at the GeoEconomics Center. Leila, what did we find in Pakistan this week?
Yeah, Pakistan's really interesting. They have an election coming up on February 8th. And kind of an interesting dynamic with that is one of the potential prime ministers, Imran Khan, has faced numerous challenges. He's currently in prison. He has over 150 charges against him. It's pretty rough for him.
Position to run for office.
Definitely. So he's had to use some creative techniques. His campaign has relied on artificial intelligence to provide a speech during virtual rallies. So
How did that go for? We were just talking about AI in the previous segment.
yeah, I mean, it happened. The only thing is that social media sites kind of mysteriously went dark during the virtual rally.
Probably some government intervention in that, because he has opposition within the military.
Yes, he does. So that's definitely a possibility.
And what about his main rival, his opponent?
His main rival is Nawaz Sharif. He is probably backed by the military, and he actually had his own legal troubles. He was living in exile in London recently and returned back to Pakistan in 2023, and he's favored to win the upcoming election.
And he's been prime minister before. There's a history here.
Yes, he was prime minister 3 times before, and he was actually ousted by the military previously.
So we're going back through the cycle, but now he's the favored candidate, both by the military, and it seems like he's going to win, or at least likely to win. And what kind of economy is he walking into in Pakistan?
The economy in Pakistan is definitely in a rough spot right now. They have an inflation rate around 30%. They have an IMF loan that's set to expire in the springtime, so that's something he's going to have to consider if he's reelected.
This is going to be a major challenge for him that he walks in on day one.
Definitely.
So we will always look at the IMF. We'll certainly try to bring some of these officials in during the IMF World Bank meetings in the spring. Anything else particularly we should be looking out for in the weeks or months ahead?
Yeah, it'll be interesting if they do want to negotiate a new IMF package, what the IMF will require them to do for their economy. There's a possibility of increasing taxes. In the past, Pakistan has favored a policy of setting the exchange rate for the Pakistani rupee, but that's something the IMF is not probably in favor of.
These would be very difficult changes politically for a new prime minister to come in. They'd be unpopular. This is always the challenge facing any leader who comes in with a difficult economic situation, to make these decisions to kind of conform to the IMF. And then the question for the IMF going forward is, can they continue to deal with this leader? Do they have to look outside to keep the program going? We'll continue to look at it here at the GeoEconomics Center. Leila, thanks so much for looking into it for us.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
You can subscribe to our newsletter at the link below. You can follow us on Twitter at @ACGeoEcon. I'm Josh Lipsky. We're the GeoEconomics team. This is Guide to the Global Economy. Thanks so much for watching.